So, hello, Dr. Gerard Casey. Welcome.
Thank you very much,
Thank you
David.
for giving your time. So, you, of course, are a Professor Emeritus from the Department of Philosophy at University College Dublin and former head of the Department of Philosophy there, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And I'm
That's my
interviewing
rap
you.
sheet.
Sorry?
That's my rap sheet.
Yeah. So, I'm interviewing you today because you very kindly did a paper for the Iona Institute called the Atheist Bluff. And we'll get onto that in due course, but just for anybody watching, the idea behind that paper, which is available on the website, is that a lot of atheists basically try to kill God, if we can put it that way, at the least possible expense, that there's all kinds of aspects of the broadly religious worldview they take for granted, and they think you can hang on to them and ditch belief in God and will only have nice consequences. So we'll get into that shortly, but I want to kind of just step back a little bit first, because
Sure.
there's kind of a couple of aspects, if you like, to the atheist bluff that I see. One is philosophical, that we come to, and another is political. And so often atheism presents itself as kind of anti-theism, if I can put it that way, anti-religion, and that it will only turn towards atheism. We atheists offer a much more tolerant and rational alternative to religion. So my first question, I guess, is how has that worked out historically in practice?
Well, you have to distinguish between the one and the many here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are lots of atheists who are perfectly easygoing, laid back, non-militant, just happy not to believe in God, get on with their life, do their stuff, fine. I mean, I was one of those at one stage myself. So I wasn't walking around, waving placards and, screaming for theists to be locked up and so on. But typically what happens in theist discussions is that you get these kind of examples, and on the atheist side, they say, look at religion, it's horrible. It's led to all this killing and these wars of religion and so on. So clearly that's a bad thing. Yes, there have been wars of religion, and yes, people have been killed, and yes, that's not a good thing. But the point is that we have, of course, examples on the other side. Now, this is not a case of two wrongs make a right, but it comes back to my point of distinguishing between, if you like, being an atheist in itself and what a government or an institution like a church, which is all powerful, for example, might do if it were able to do so. So, for example, the 20th century, of course, has been staggering because we had this incredible sociological experiment in the Soviet Union, which was the first time a polity had tried to live explicitly, not only without religion, but, if you like, by opposing and trying to destroy religion almost completely. And as we all know, that was a roaring success. All right. It led, now, again, as usual, people who are killed in these instances, sometimes they are killed because it's political, and sometimes they're killed because it's religious, and sometimes the two overlap. For example, we have our own example of that, for example, in Ireland, in the persecutions that took place, for example, after the introduction of Protestantism in the 16th century. And so it's very hard to tell precisely what the reasons are. You can always say it's political rather than religious, and religious rather than political. But in any case, we see the same thing right now in China, where there is, we don't quite know the level of repression, but being religious, let me put it this way, is not a plus for you. If you have any ambitions to succeed in life, certainly in the public sphere, you can forget about it. And of course, we saw other instances in the former Soviet bloc, with the possible exception of Poland. And there only, I think, because for historical reasons, the church was largely separate from the state, so that it had its own, as it were, network, its own way of surviving. Whereas, for example, in Russia, the Orthodox Church, this is not meant in any way to be a criticism, but the Orthodox Church was very closely linked, as it were, with the state, and so wasn't really in a position to oppose it very successfully when the pressure came on. So I come back to the starting point, was that atheism, or being an atheist itself, isn't necessarily problematic. It's unlikely that a group of atheists are now meeting somewhere in Mount Merion, plotting to assassinate me. At least I hope not. But it's certainly true that we have seen. So the sort of story we are told that it's easygoing and tolerant is not borne out by the political events of the 20th century.
No, I mean, I was reading recently a book called Sacred Space is Never Empty, and it's a history of the relationship between, if you like, Soviet atheism and religion, and the shifting attitudes of the Soviet state towards religion. Because it went from a really militant early phase where I tried to wipe it out, and then it gets a little bit more accommodationist. And then actually under Khrushchev, oddly, and you wouldn't expect this, it got more hostile again. Like not as bad as early Lenin and Stalin, but quite bad. And early on, there was something called the League of the Militant Godless. I mean, what a great name.
It's brilliant.
And one of its specialties, apart from, trivial things like knocking down churches and so on, constant mockery of religion.
Yeah.
All right. And, it's an easy enough thing to do, let's face it. But nonetheless, this was hardly a tolerant and benign and smiley face, was it? So as soon as they got hold of a society, this is what they started to do. Whereas, there's plenty of episodes of militancy, obviously, in the history of religion, but it took centuries to get to something like the Inquisition. Whereas Soviet Union, straight away, they set up things like the League of the Militant Godless on knocking down churches and imprisoning priests. So it doesn't really speak well for the argument that atheism equals rationality and tolerance, does it?
No. In fact, the Inquisition is an interesting case because in the English-speaking world, the impression is that the Spanish Inquisition killed millions of people. But of course, it didn't. In fact, the figures are relatively low. That obviously didn't make it pleasant for those people who were on the receiving end. But by and large, the Spanish Inquisition was an operation carried out by the Spanish state, sometimes in opposition to the church. And it comes back to the point I was making earlier. It was one of those cases where politics and religion were intertwined, so that your loyalty, if you like, to the Spanish state was linked so closely to Catholicism that the two that to be one was to be the other, and not to be one was not to be the other. And therefore, what you saw, and this of course occurred at the beginning of the modern period and the emergence of nationalism. So it's vitally important. And remember, by the way, in Spain only became a unified country at the end of the 15th century. And therefore, it was very nervous, if you like, about anything which might, in its eyes, in the eyes of the Spanish state, lead to opposition or fragmentation. I'm not excusing it. I'm simply pointing out the complexity of the situation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you've obviously spent your working life in academia. Within modern philosophy departments, how prevalent would atheism be?
Oh, can't say because I haven't got the figures, but if you wanted my guess, what they say on the quiz shows, my educated guess, I would say 97.83%.
Wow. Okay.
Almost entirely, almost total.
Even higher than I expected.
Oh yeah. Well, I might be wrong. It might only be 90, but it would. But I mean, if you took academia as a whole, I would say when you bring in the science departments and engineering departments, the numbers go down because quite a few engineers and physicists and so on are actually believers. The figures for atheism would, I believe, be higher in the humanities departments. But we have a proxy figure for this, or proxy figure, which is that over the last 30 to 40 years, the ratio in the United States between political liberals and political conservatives has altered in a quite dramatic fashion, so that the proportion of political conservatives in the United States campuses would be probably 10% or less. Right now, this is not exactly the same thing, but if you took that figure as a sort of proxy for religious believers on the grounds that it's more likely that conservatives are believers than liberals, then you're going to get something very close, I would say, to those figures.
And among this 90 to 97.5% of academic philosophers who are atheists, how many would you think would be actively, militantly anti-religion?
Probably few enough, because philosophers tend not to be militant about anything. Their sort of the go-to reaction is, now let's see, on the one hand and on the other hand. So there would be some, but I suspect that the militancy would probably come sort of lower down in the kind of academic scale as you move towards sociology, social science, and those areas. Uh, but I couldn't say for certain. I mean, that's speculation.
Okay, now out in the general population, and again, this can really only be anecdotal. Um, what what would be, if you had to guess, the for every 100 people, um, how many do you think now would say they believe in God?
Yeah, and the answer again is it depends. It depends on what how you define that. I mean, if you're talking about the sort of God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, fairly robust, full-blooded God, if you'll pardon the expression, a God that sort of is interested in us and concerned about us and wants to relate to us and so on, then who knows? Probably in the region of 40, maybe to 50%. When you move more vaguely to something like spirituality, is there something there? Is there a sort of ground of being or whatever? Then the figures get higher, probably reaching about 70%. If anything, if the figures I read in the various periodicals I read or anything like it. So the vaguer it gets, the wider the people are prepared to sign up to something. The more specific, the fewer. But I suspect something in the region of maybe 50%. Now, again, it depends on where you go. Higher in the United States than in Europe, but not as low in Europe as is generally believed, because the people who tend to write about these things are generally the people who belong to the class who don't believe, and they tend, without falsifying things necessarily, to highlight the levels of unbelief. It's a bit like what you experience on the sort of dinner party circuit. I mean, if you're going to dinner parties with a certain group of people who all have the sort of same opinions as you, there's a tendency, there's what's known as confirmation bias. There's a tendency to think that the world is seen this way by pretty much everybody else, or at least every right-thinking person, which means, of course, the people that you'd like to go to dinner parties with. And that's not the case.
Yeah, there was a famous example of, I think, a New York Times journalist back in 1972, and Nixon won an absolute landslide victory, and she was shocked because she knew nobody who voted for Nixon. And there was a similar case in France when France voted against, I think it was the EU Constitutional Treaty, and I think France voted against that by something like 52-48. And again, she was living in Paris, shocked because nobody she knew voted no. And so you tend to think that your bubble, even if it's a very important bubble, is the entire world.
That's right. Well, that's true for everybody, by the way. That's true for theists as well. I mean, if you associate largely, with church-going people and believers, you tend to think there are probably more of them, and so on. But there are
I think, Gerard, though, it's a bit harder for us because, like our bubble, if you like, is situated inside their bubble.
That's right.
Okay, so we're exposed all the time to their views, like in movies, TV dramas, documentaries, books, ordinary conversation, the way news is covered. It's just their view all the time, self-reinforcing. So it's very hard for us to kind of be oblivious to the fact that there's a different point of view out there, where it's easier for them to think, well, only lunatics have this other point of view.
No, that's absolutely true. And indeed, in my teaching days, I used to say to students to have the courage of their convictions. There's a point to this. I used to ask some student a fairly obvious question, and the student would answer correctly. And then I would wait a few moments and say, "Are you sure?" And they would go, and start backtracking. And then they say, "Well, you should be sure because you're correct." And I said, if you're sure about what you believe, then state it. Okay, and the mere fact that somebody in authority, or in our cases in the media, in other words, those people, if you like, can put pressure on you, don't be intimidated into backing down. And the problem is, of course, that we have now learned that that as believers are sort of an inferior intellectual class. We are supposed to be not quite brilliant. We're, the people, atheists of the sort of Daniel Dennett and Dawkins variety, describe themselves as the brights. Of course, the contrast of brights are the dark. Okay, so it's not quite as crude as calling us stupid, but it's pretty close. And indeed, you know, when I was not a believer, I thought religious believers were stupid. So, like, from my own personal experience, I can simply say, yeah, that a lot of people either might be polite, and I'm not prepared to call you that in public, but secretly that's what you're thinking. You're not sufficiently enlightened. And of course, it comes through in media, it comes through in film. And I mean, what you were talking about in Russia, what was it? The Militant League for, I
The
can't
League
remember
of the Militant Godless.
Militant Zone, yeah. I mean, the idea was that the only ones who would continue to believe in God in the new Soviet Union were the babushkas, the grandmothers, who were too stupid and too old to change their ways,
and will die off anyway,
and could be laughed at and jeered at and so on. Yeah. Whereas all of the bright, intelligent people, all the go-ahead people, the people in media and television and radio and newspapers, all of those intelligent people obviously signed up to.
Yeah, there were various institutes in the Soviet Union dedicated to spreading atheism and combating religion. And these again got a new head of steam under Khrushchev. But apparently when Yuri Gagarin became the first man to go into space, they thought this was fantastic pro-atheist propaganda, because look, he's left Earth's orbit, he's gone into space, and where's God? There's no God. And they were kind of very disappointed when they discovered ordinary Russians weren't buying this argument, because they kind of said, we didn't expect to see God out there. You know, God is kind of above and beyond creation. He's outside it. And so it was kind of a bit strange to me that very intelligent people would think that, okay, he's gone into space and there's no God, therefore there's no God. It's a kind of trivial kind of argument, and it's a bit surprising to see them hold it. But just getting back to the kind of state of religious belief in Ireland, I think you've alluded to it, there's this kind of thing, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And an awful lot of people seem to fall into that camp. And you'll also see, like, a lot of people, and this, you see the same thing in opinion polls in the United States. I don't consider that I belong to any given religion. And then it's assumed, well, maybe they're atheist or agnostic. But then you ask them, do you pray? And they say they do pray. So they don't tick any of the boxes in the census form anymore, you know, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, or whatever. So they might even tick no religion, because that's the only box they can tick. But they pray nonetheless. There's some version of God they have in their heads.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, I mean, in a television program whose name escapes me at the moment, a person about to become the English Prime Minister hires somebody from academia to do research for him. And she takes the job, and he asked her why she took the job, and she said, because I wanted to see if in polling I could get exactly the answers I wanted by framing the questions in the right way. And he said, and did you? She said, yes.
Of course.
So, I mean, you know, your organization does polling all the time. And I'm sorry, I'm not accusing you of framing the question, but you know that if you frame questions in a particular way, you're more likely to get answers of a particular kind. And therefore, I mean, all polls have to be taken with several grains of salt. You need to know the questions that were asked and who they were asked to and the extent of the poll and so on. And even then, you know, you need to be.
Have you ever come across the term moralistic therapeutic deism?
Moralistic? No, I can say happily.
I think it was coined by an American sociologist of religion called Christian Smith. It's the guy I'm thinking of. He's at Notre Dame University, and basically he thinks that an awful lot of people in the West today subscribe to this thing that he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. So what he means is, you know, they believe in a God who wants you to be good, who's kind of there as a kind of inoffensive aunt, or even, you know, uncle to turn to in times of need, and he'll comfort you, or she'll comfort you. But actually quite remote and not really involved in your life, except when you want him/her/it to be involved. Therefore, quasi, you know, deistic. But above all, this is a non-judging, non-demanding God who doesn't really expect anything of you.
That's right. That's a kind of down market deism. Okay, whereas like the deists for the intellectual class would be slightly higher and slightly more disengaged. Morality would probably go out the window anyway. But here, yes, it's like you're kind of kindly uncle whom you visit, and whenever you visit, you get little presents, and you don't have to do chores. And you know, every time you're with him, it's kind of fine. It's like a holiday, and then you have to go home to your parents, and they make you do chores and all of that sort of stuff and homework. Yeah. That's I'm not at all surprised that people have that view. And the interesting thing about what you said, of course, is not only is that it's non-judging. Okay, it's like I'm okay, you're okay, whatever you do, is fine.
Mm.
Just keep on doing it. Don't worry about it. Don't get any hang-ups.
Mm.
Whatever you do, it's just grand. It's not
And
a
by the
problem.
way, a lot of Christianity seems to have kind of succumbed to this view of God,
Yeah, indeed.
right? You know, this I'm
Yep.
okay, you're okay type of God who makes no demands.
Well, what they do is they confuse the idea, which is perfectly orthodox, with which is that God's in Christianity, God's love for us is unconditional,
Mm.
which means that God never stops loving us, right? So it's not like we have to, if we behave badly, he stops loving us until we behave well again, okay, in the
Mm.
way that, for example, human beings do. But they make the mistake of thinking that unconditional love doesn't make demands.
Mm.
The story, of course, the parable, or sorry, not the parable, but the incident in scriptures which highlights this point completely is, of course, the example of the woman taken in adultery.
Mm.
Because Jesus is there, and they come to him and say, "Now, what should we do?" And he starts. The only time he does any writing, by the way, he starts writing in the sand.
Mm.
And then he says, of course, the famous phrase, "Let him who is without sin
Mm.
cast a stone."
Mm.
And then they start dropping the stones. By the way, the oldest first, and eventually they all leave. And then he says to the woman, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "There aren't any."
Mm.
And then he says, "Neither do I
Mm.
accuse you." But now this is the interesting part. This is the part that almost everybody forgets. And then he says, "Go and
Sin no
sin
more.
no more."
Mm.
Okay,
Mm. Mm.
that's important. He
Mm.
doesn't say, "Go, they were terrible people. That was
Mm.
just a
Mm.
really
Mm.
crass instance of the patriarchy.
So go
My
about your
God, where
business.
was the man that was with you? Why wasn't he?"
Yeah.
He just says, looking at her, "Go and sin no more." And
Mm.
that's the demand that's made by the Christian God, not by the deist Uncle Joe type God.
Yeah. So mercy plus a standard.
Yeah, there's justice and mercy, and in some ways it's a kind of a mystery how these are balanced. And we all hope, by the way, that when we stand before God, that mercy prevails over
Mm-hmm.
justice. Uh, but nonetheless, uh, it's important to realize that a real religion makes demands. If I could just tell you a personal anecdote
Mm.
for just a moment or two. When I was in the United States, I was at a party in a town about 20 miles away from Notre Dame, and I met a fellow Irishman there who had met before, and he introduced himself and we chatted, and he said, "Oh, I'm coming back to religion." And I go, "Well, that's very, very interesting.
Mm.
Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to the Unitarians." Now, I don't want to be really rude to the Unitarians,
Mm.
but I said, what more or less is the point? Unless you really fancy sort of tea and biscuits on a Sunday and some kind of, morally uplifting discourse.
Mm.
I said, become a Dutch Reformed, a Baptist, Southern Baptist,
Mm.
a Lutheran, a Calvinist,
Mm.
somebody
Mm.
who actually believes something where the religion makes demands on you. Because, and I gave the general point, if it doesn't hurt
Mm.
somewhere, if it just fits you comfortably like an old shoe,
Mm.
chances are it's not particularly worth anything. I'm not saying necessarily come back to
Yeah.
Catholicism, right? But just find something that actually gets you out of your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
And the chances are that it's going to make a difference to your life. Otherwise, what is the point?
Exactly. Now, listen, you were saying you were once an atheist, and
Yes.
obviously now you're practicing Catholic. So, if you can just describe briefly why were you an atheist and why did you come back to the Catholic Church?
I should say, by the way, to be described as a practicing Catholic always makes me think, yeah, I need a lot of practice.
Yeah.
But oh well, who knows? I mean, I was young. I started reading philosophy when I was a young teenager. So by the time I was 16, I'd read quite a bit, including, by the way, Bertrand Russell's "Why I'm Not a Christian,"
Mm.
which was the first book I actually bought. I remember buying it in Eason's in Cork and being completely blown away by it. Not
Mm.
least because it was the first time I had an insight into a world which wasn't part of the cozy world in which I grew up.
Mm.
There weren't many. I mean, it said that there aren't many atheists in foxholes, and there certainly weren't many atheists, at least not proclaimed atheists, in Cork in the 1950s or
Mm.
1960s.
Mm.
So this was a bit of a shock. And then I started reading fairly widely, and it seemed to me now, I mean, some of this has to do with age and hormones and so on, but um, it seemed to me that the religion I'd been given, and certainly the reasons I'd been given for believing, didn't really stand up well upon
Mm.
investigation. And I can remember my parents, God bless them both, must have been sort of worried about this because at one stage a priest happened to visit our house. I suspect it wasn't coincidental,
Mm.
right? And we engaged in a conversation, which was very, very polite. But I was singularly unconvinced and singularly unpersuaded by what he had to say. Of course, I was incredibly arrogant, let's be frank.
And a budding professional philosopher.
But some people would say nothing has changed in that regard. And then I was convinced. No, as I said, I wasn't a militant atheist, and so on. But I also wasn't a hypocrite. And one of the things I know from the period is I came under enormous pressure to conform externally. Just to go. People would say things like, "Well, we know you don't believe, but look, go anyway," and so on. And I refused to do that on the grounds that A, it was hypocritical, which is the first thing, but B, also that it was actually disrespectful to believers.
How old were you at this stage?
I was about 16 or 17.
Okay.
And then I thought, in my heart of hearts, like consoling myself with my immense intellectual superiority, that religious believers were stupid, and I was intelligent and more intelligent than they were. I could see through all this nonsense. And then I didn't think about it anymore for quite a while. I had a sort of period when I was in universities in my mid-20s. I took a course with John Dowling in UCC, and he gave a course on Aquinas, and I can remember being introduced to the works of Aquinas for the first time and being struck very favorably by the kind of robust realism of this thinker and the incredible intellectuality of, this is the sheer power of his mind, which comes through in his writing. So I was impressed by that. So that was obviously a little chip away at my foundations. But it wasn't until I went to the University of Notre Dame that things changed. And I suppose if you say, why did I become a Catholic or a Christian in those circumstances? There would be intellectual reasons, there would be moral reasons, and there would be personal reasons. The intellectual reasons was, well, part of it, and connects up, I suppose, with the environmental ones, that most of the graduate students in the Notre Dame philosophy department were actually religious believers. Now, I know this seems a bit contradictory to what I said earlier, but Notre Dame is a special case.
It's a Catholic university.
In a Catholic university. But interestingly enough, they weren't Catholics.
Right.
Okay. They were Dutch Reformed and Wesleyan Presbyterian, Wesleyan Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists and so on and so forth. And of course, they weren't stupid. So this was a blow to my comforting idea that religious beliefs were necessarily stupid. Moreover, we spent a lot of time, of course, not doing the work we were supposed to be doing and chatting about other things. And one of the things they liked to talk about were religious doctrines, and they would talk about the intricacies of the differences between them and so on. And I, kind of being Irish, unlike the Irishman who came up onto the wharf in the 19th century in New York and found a fight in progress and said, "Is this private or can anyone join in?" Any intellectual argument is okay for me. So I didn't particularly have a dog in the fight, but I'm happy to weigh in. So I joined in, and this went on for years, for about 3 years. Like questions like, is infant baptism efficacious? That might seem the most sort of recondite of subjects, but they would argue passionately about it. But they tended to agree, by the way, that whatever differences they had among themselves, at least they weren't like the benighted Catholics who had these crazy views that, you kind of drove up to the church on the Sunday, like filling up a car at the petrol station. You kind of filled up with grace for the week and then drove off, came back next week and did it. And I, of course, wasn't a Catholic, and I didn't mind the church being hanged, by the way, but I did want it hanged for the right offense. And I didn't think it was getting a fair trial on this one. So I started doing a bit of research, and I came across a book in the library by Ludwig Ott called The Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. And that became my little secret go-to. So whenever they sort of ganged up on me and I was sort of stuck for an answer, I said, "Okay, guys, let's take 5 back again next week," or whatever. I started reading the stuff, and over that kind of 3-year period, I acquired quite a significant grasp on Catholic doctrine from a purely external point of view. In the same way that somebody studying, say, Tibetan Buddhism could. You could know the moves and the concepts and how they work together and so on. So that was one thing. From the social point of view, of course, personal point of view, about 2 years into my time at Notre Dame, my first son was born, Brendan. And as you will know, and as any parent listening will know, when you have children, your perspective on life changes. When you don't have children, you're sort of concerned what will happen next month, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. But as soon as you have a child, your horizon of concern goes like this. It goes out 20 years and indeed even beyond. And as you know, again, as a parent, even though you're only legally responsible for your children up to the age of 18 or whatever, you never cease to be a parent. So that was an existential shock. And that made me think about, that kind of forced me to think about what I thought about things.
Yeah, and broader horizons.
So between my friends who were believers and this, and then also without knowing it, on the moral side, I had come to an appreciation for the coherence of the moral stance of Catholicism across the board, but particularly in relation to sexual matters. And up to and obviously including abortion and indeed life-related matters generally. So I wasn't happy about this because I thought, you know, it was kind of really nonsense. It was really annoying that this moribund group of people should be more or less right on this. So all of these things were kind of converging for me, and I didn't know it. And then I had I mean, I'll go on with this if you like. I mean, I can stop there, but I had a funny experience. We kind of brought it all together.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, just very briefly. So this was going on, and so then a friend of mine who asked me one night, we'd been out to the movies together and having a cup of tea, and it was late at night and it was kind of quiet. And then he said, "Why aren't you a Christian?" And you know something? Nobody had asked me this. And I started to answer, but I had a very peculiar experience when I answered, which was that I could kind of see myself from outside giving the answers. And I suddenly realized that what I was saying wasn't necessarily what I believed. Not because I knew what I believed, but because without realizing it, I had shifted from where I was to somewhere else. I didn't know where I was. It's a bit like, you know, when your sat nav is kind of out of sync and not up to date, and there's a new road and it suddenly shows you in the middle of a field. Okay. I was kind of like that. I was in the middle of the field, and that was sort of intellectually terrifying. So then I had to read like crazy and think about it. And then I had another experience, I won't go into that, which brought it together. And eventually I realized that, yeah, without knowing it, I had become a theist and indeed a Catholic. Yeah.
I mean, when I went to live in Australia, which was straight after university, I kind of drifted away. It was mainly by laziness. I'd been going to Mass at a convention in Ireland, stopped going. Then met my wife to be, who at the time was Protestant, and met a whole bunch of her fellow church members, and they got me thinking or challenging what I believed, in a very, like, not in an aggressive way or anything. So I decided to take up and read, and I remember being vaguely appalled that Catholicism was making a lot more sense to me than I thought, right? So I was also kind of thinking, why didn't anybody tell me this before? Why did I have to find this out for myself? But anyway, that's just kind of very short-potted version of that. But just onto the paper about the Atheist Bluff. So the reason I asked you to write it is because as I've been reading atheists themselves and listening to people like Richard Dawkins, who are probably the most famous of all the atheists, but also these other new atheists, as they were calling them, when all these books began to come out around the time of the God Delusion, like, you know, Sam Harris and these people, and discovered none of them believe in free will. And I thought, okay, this seems kind of significant, because a lot kind of hinges on whether there's such a thing as free will. And the reason, as far as I can see, that they don't believe in it is because they believe matter is all that exists. There's nothing outside of matter. Physical laws govern all matter. Our thoughts are the product of matter, which is controlled by physics. And they conclude there's no free will, therefore, because everything physical is controlled by physical laws, and our thoughts are the product of physical forces, which are controlled by physical laws. And of course, if there's no free will, then where does moral accountability come in, which seems to kind of presuppose free will? Like, I put this to Richard Dawkins when I debated him back in about 2006, because I discovered he doesn't believe in free will. And what he tried to say was, I'm not interested in that question. And I said, well, you can't really avoid it. There's too much rides on it. So anyway, I asked you to write this paper, and particularly look at a book, and I think you found this slightly torture, called...
I hate you for this, by the way. I told you on the phone, okay? I want to put on the public record that I hate David Quinn.
Thank you. You're not the only one. Called The Atheist Guide to Reality by Alex Rosenberg, who was himself an atheist. And he kind of draws out the implications of atheism in a way that actually an awful lot of atheists themselves have probably never confronted, because your average atheist probably does believe in free will and think, well, why wouldn't I? It seems a perfectly natural thing to believe in. And also the idea that there's some kind of a moral law out there existing independently of our minds, which is waiting to be discovered, and some things are right and wrong themselves. And it turns out that has to be kind of ditched as well. So I suppose if you can, and I suppose the atheist bluff is they hope nobody will notice any of this stuff. Okay, and they won't understand the really deep implications of atheism for things we take absolutely for granted, like the existence of free will. So, what are your thoughts on that? And where does atheism really lead in those kind of regards?
Well, no, first of all, your description of the beliefs of Dennett and Dawkins and Harris and others is correct. None of them believe in free will. None of them. They're all fully determinist, and they're all card-carrying materials.
Although Dennett believes in something called compatibilism.
Yeah, well, that's as a philosopher, I've tried to make sense of this, and that has always seemed to me to be a classic example of having your cake and eating it too.
Could you describe what it is, by the way?
Well, compatibilism is the idea that somehow you can accept determinism, and nonetheless there is still a form of freedom which is compatible, hence the name, with that. But I've never been able to understand what kind of freedom that is, because it turns out not to be the idea. For me, freedom means that you have the ability to, in any given situation, which is important, to decide to go one way rather than the other, and that your decision to do so is undetermined. But if you are actually a materialist and a determinist, your choice is determined. So I don't
physical
understand,
laws, basically.
by physical laws, and therefore I don't quite understand how that's supposed to work. So I mean, I've always seen that as a kind of as a cop-out, right? But anyway, so your more robust atheists are sort of materialists, and therefore they think physics explains everything, and physics explains chemistry, and chemistry biology, and biology neuroscience, and neuroscience, and so on. So your mind, thoughts, intentions, plans, purposes, will, these are all effects of things going on in your brain. They are the results of material activities. They do not themselves cause anything. And one of the things, of course, they have to explain is that why does it seem as if they do? And they say typically, well, that's an illusion, right? For various reasons. Some give an evolutionary explanation, say evolution has created us in this way so that we will do it. And I go, yeah, sure. It doesn't make a lot of sense. By the way, if indeed you really do believe it's illusory, why should it have any effect on you? Why if you thought that morality and intentionality, the idea that we act for reasons and purposes, and that when we give these explanations we're genuinely pointing to a feature which is genuinely real and not mere fantasy, then what are you doing? I mean, it's very hard to understand what they're actually doing themselves. So look, think about this. Science, I have no problem with science, but science is a human activity. It's done by human beings who get up in the morning and have breakfast, read their mail, go to the laboratories, conduct their experiments, talk to their colleagues, try to get a paper published, complain about not getting grants. In other words, they are human beings who behave like us in every way. If their paycheck didn't appear in their bank account at the end of the month, and they went to the college and said, what's happening here? Somebody would say, oh, I don't know, we just kind of on a whim decided not to pay anyone this month. They'd be outraged, they'd be horrified. They'd say, you can't do that sort of thing, it's not right. And all this language now. And they're absolutely right to do that. The point is, however, if they believe what they say they believe about materialism and the implications it has for plans and purposes and intentions and will, they're not entitled to do any of these things. The way they live their lives makes no sense, right? It's just, it cannot be justified.
Yeah, how many, you mentioned that the vast majority of professional philosophers don't believe in God. Where would they stand on free will?
I suspect that most of them would probably be compatibilists, which is an attempt to save the kind of phenomena of what looked like choice without compromising materialistic determinism. But I've never seen the coherence of that.
Yeah, because I mean, how can they possibly be free of physical laws if all they believe is matter of physics?
My point exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
it seems to me that there are only two options here. either determinism, which by the way is not a I should point out, by the way, is not a scientific discovery, is not a consequence of scientific research. It's a presupposition of science. And by the way, it's a presupposition of 19th century science, not necessarily 20th century quantum mechanics, where it doesn't apply. Okay, so it turns out the philosophers think that while they think they're doing science and they have this kind of, they relate to science and scientists as if they were pop stars. They're in awe. I mean, they're just like, they go weak at the knees when scientists condescend to look at them and pay attention to them. But they have a very kind of antiquated notion of what science is, and particularly in relation to causality. But in any event, determinism is not a scientific consequence or a position. It's a presupposition that they bring to their studies, and therefore it's not surprising that if you bring your harp to the party, you're going to discover a harp at the party when you get there, right? And that's what they do. So, but if that's the case, and if everything is determined, then it seems to me that you really do have to be somebody like Rosenberg. And I mean, despite the fact that his book drove me mad, he is consistent. If you take all of this consistency, it seems to me correct to say there is no such thing as free will. There is no such thing as choice. There are no such things as purposes. And your thoughts and intentions, none of those make any sense. These are all illusions.
And obviously, no moral law comes out of anything physical.
Nope.
Physical laws don't produce moral law. So therefore, moral law is simply, from that point of view, a complete human invention.
Yeah, well, whatever they may be,
all the rest of it.
Yeah, it's hard to see how they can exist in any even plausibly mediocre sense of realism. It's you typically what you get is, well, it's convenient for us to behave in this way as if, okay, and so on, and again, for practically speaking, just as to return to the question you began with, just as most atheists aren't really eager to start World War III. Those who believe in this consequences simply live their life just like anybody else. But my point is that Rosenberg, to his credit, I mean, has written this very annoying book, but nonetheless, in which he makes it perfectly plain that if you think materialism is what it is and determinism is a consequence of materialism, then none of these things exist in any real sense. And morality has to get, if it really has no grounding at all, and if it has any purpose or function, then it's going to be explained in kind of quasi-scientific way as emerging from the processes of evolution or something along those lines. That's typically what you get.
To see what I like about some of these writers is if I say this sort of thing, well, then other atheists will say to me, well, you would say that you're a Christian and you're trying to kind of present atheism in a bad light. So, well, okay, never mind me. Look at these atheists like Rosenberg, or Dawkins, or Harris, and what they say about free will. Or look at somebody like Nietzsche, right? Because he saw very clearly where atheism led, way back, and I'm sure there's plenty before him the same. So there's an awful lot of trying to have it both ways with atheism, actually, isn't there?
Yeah, it's I mean, Nietzsche again was saw clearly, and he wondered why it is that if you wanted to ditch the Christian God, and he was quite happy to do that, why would you want to hang on to the kinds of morality which had derived from what people thought God wanted them to be doing and not to be doing? Why wouldn't you throw that out as well? And it's really puzzling. And of course, he's absolutely correct. And so typically what happens is that the intellectual side and the moral side don't quite match up. And so many atheists, not really, I don't mean to be rude, but not really thinking about this, are quite happy to accept the kind of mores that they find functioning in the society around them. They're nice to their children, they're good to their husbands and wives, they pay their taxes, they do various things and so on and so forth. And they don't really...
All of which makes sense, by the way, from a utilitarian point of view, right? Because because they'd argue from an evolutionary point of view, it makes sense to be cooperative. And therefore, if you really push them and they admitted, well, nothing is right or wrong in itself, and there's no moral law out there independently of our heads waiting to be found. It's all convention, but it so happens that it makes sense from a kind of day-to-day way to live your life to be cooperative and nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're correct in that. by and large, and indeed, I would say, even for many Christians, their day-to-day operations are governed in large part by the kind of functional mores that they find around them in society. And if those change, then they would change as well. But the point is, if your moral philosophy is founded on utilitarianism, then let's say that you come to the conclusion that you mentioned, namely that it makes sense for everybody to behave in this way. But of course, that doesn't explain why somebody wouldn't choose to be, as it were, a moral free rider, if and when the opportunity presented itself. In other words, I can agree, for example, that it is good for everybody, including me, if people don't rob and steal and all of the rest. But I can also agree, by the way, that if I can get away with it without being detected, okay, it makes perfect sense for me to rob and to steal and to do all of these other things.
Or if you're so powerful, you can't be caught.
Absolutely. If I can do it with impunity and nobody can get at me,
which
why shouldn't
plenty of times in history?
Why shouldn't I? And then the point I used to put to my students, which used to make them uncomfortable, because most students are sort of knee-jerk utilitarians for the most part. But I would say, all right, well, that's fine for many things. We use cost-benefit analysis in relation to many things we do. But how about this? Suppose you're walking down the street and you see a guy standing over a little kid in a stroller, and when you get closer, you realize he's sticking pins into the kid's eye, and the kid is squealing in agony, and you go, "Ooh, I think you should stop." Okay. And the guy goes, "Why is that?" And you say, "Well, now, what are you going to say?" If you're a utilitarian, you're going to have to say something like, "Well, on the balance of pleasure over pain," or if you're an act utilitarian, you're going to have to describe what is normally the case in these circumstances. But the chap it's open to the chap to say, look, I realize that this causes pain to the child, but in fact, that's part of why I do this, because I like causing pain and I get an enormous amount of pleasure. And when we put my pleasure on the scales with the pain of the child, my pleasure is vastly greater than the pain of the child. So what are you going to do about it? Now, most normal people will say, I don't care. What happens when you put them into the scales and suddenly the utilitarianism gets stitched? It's just wrong to do that, right? Now, the trouble is, when you move,
presupposes a moral law that's independent.
which is exactly right, because now you have a problem. So what makes it to be just wrong? It can't be utilitarian grounds, because on utilitarian grounds, the guy has just shown you that it's absolutely right, and so on. Unless you want to factor in your displeasure, now you want to do a quick count around the world to see how it works out, and that just makes no sense. We don't.
And you might say, well, it's just wrong to cause pain, but why is it just wrong to cause pain?
Yeah, exactly.
Where's that written?
Yeah. So, but then now you're into a kind of what's known in the trade as deontology, which is the idea that there are duties and rights, and there are things that are just right and things that are just wrong. But that raises the question: what makes it to be so? Now, if you're a kind of Kantian, you say, well, it has something like the principle of universalizability. Can we make what it is you're doing a maxim for everybody, a maxim, I beg your pardon, so that everybody can act in it coherently? And the idea here is that you get into some form of self-contradiction if you engage in acts that are wrong, and they're wrong because they're contradictory. And that's not, I would say that's not entirely wrong. It's not entirely nonsensical, but it has a certain kind of emaciated look about it. It's sort of certain bloodlessness to it. And most of us don't really think like that. Most of us would react with our reaction, for example, to the gory example I just gave, would be very visceral. We wouldn't be simply saying in a detached way, oh, I think that's right. We would be angry. Our emotions would be engaged. Our whole being would be revulsed by this, right? And in that way, I think that is absolutely correct. But that still leaves the question: what is the grounding for how we feel? Maybe our feelings are just out of kilter. Maybe the pain inflictor is in the right here. How do we make a difference, right? And so therefore, that's why for me, theism is the only way, satisfactory way. I'm not denying that there are arguments and philosophers will argue about this, but the only satisfactory way for doing it and for grounding our morality. And the reason for that is because the fatherhood of God in the Christian tradition means that we are all children and all equal and all valuable simply because of that relationship. And it means that whatever value I have in the eyes of God is no different intrinsically from the value that anybody else has. And therefore, I'm not entitled to behave towards somebody else in any way that I choose, because in doing that, I'm open to the possibilities, as it were, of having the same done to me without protest. Now, there are some people who have thought that way. Some people who have said, have bitten the bullet on this and said, yeah, I think I'm actually free to treat others in any way that I choose. And you go, right, but if that's the case, then if others do the same to you, you're not in a position to give a principled protest. I mean, obviously you can try to physically stop them doing it, but you can't say things like it's wrong to do it or you shouldn't do that, okay, because you rule that kind of language out. And it's open to somebody to say, yeah, I accept. Now that position isn't totally incoherent, but it's so unbelievable right, that I've only met one person in my entire life who actually said that to me seriously.
And of course, if we backtrack a few steps, if there's no free will, if people like Dawkins and Francis Crick and Sam Harris and all these people are correct and there's no free will, well, then the person who's inflicting pain is not doing so out of a free choice, are they? They're doing so because of all kinds of things that happened before, cause and effect, the neurons firing in their brain, physical laws that work on them. But there's no freely choosing person who is actually doing this if there's no free will. So the whole thing just becomes, humanly speaking, just completely untenable to believe. And yet, again, don't, like there's, people watching this who are not religious, don't take our word for it. Read people like Rosenberg. And argue with him why he's wrong and why you can say that there's only matter, but nonetheless there's free will, and there's only matter, and nonetheless we somehow get moral laws that exist independently of human society and convention. But if I can just ask you one final question, Gerard, because I know we can talk all day, but I'm kind of conscious of we're actually coming up to an hour. As simply as possible, if you're speaking to a lay audience, what is the best argument in favor of the existence of God?
Well, I'm not dodging your question, but different people will give different answers. For me, the argument that brought me to a belief in God before I became a Christian was what's sometimes known as the argument from contingency. And what that means is the following. Something like the following. There are many versions of this, but I'll just give one off the top of my head. If you look around the world, I mean, if you look out the window and you see, say, an automobile that's sitting there on the pavement, there was a time when it didn't exist. There will be a time in the future when it ceases to exist. It'll rust, it'll fall apart, and so on. The same is true about everything in your house: your desk, your carpets, the walls, even the houses themselves. The trees that grow in your garden, the grass. To cut a long story short, everything, the world that we now live in, our world, didn't exist at one time. It will cease to exist in the future. The whole universe, to me, has this characteristic of contingency. In other words, there is nothing about it in any of its parts which tell me that they have to exist. And indeed, putting all the parts together and you get the whole universe, there's nothing about the universe as a whole which tells me that it has to exist. Now, here's the thing. If ever there was a time when there was absolutely nothing, and by the way, when I say nothing, I don't mean sort of a darkness, because darkness is something, okay? It's an odd kind of something, or waves or patterns or numbers or anything like that. I'm not talking about any of these things. When there's absolutely nothing, it's impossible to imagine absolutely nothing, but you have to kind of conceive of, in other words, then if ever there was absolutely nothing, it seemed to me beyond doubt that there could not now be anything. You cannot get something from nothing. If you want it in Latin, ex nihil nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. Now, all right. So we have something which exists, but whose existence is contingent, and therefore it cannot be its own cause, it cannot be its own reason, it cannot be its own justification, and yet it exists. Nothing. So it either has existed, as it were, from eternity, always existed, which would make it, in fact, non-contingent, but we've ruled that out. Okay, or there has to be something, an entity, whose very nature it is to exist, and it's not contingent. And that factor X. Now, that doesn't get you the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That just gets you something like Aristotle's God, who is a necessary being. Okay? But once you have the idea that there has to be a necessary being, otherwise there couldn't be anything, and since the manifest is something, then there has to be this non-contingent factor. Then the question becomes, what's the relationship between that necessary being and the contingent universe in which we exist? And that kind of opens the door to Christianity. You know, it opens the door to many more things than that. But for me, it was a major removal, or was the removal of a major block. The Christian story, of course, tells us a lot more. A lot more. We can't get that from pure reason. We get that from revelation, but it's consistent with it. For me, so sorry to be so long-winded, but for me, that's the argument that really disposed me to becoming a Christian again.
Yeah, I once heard somebody very neatly put what he thinks an atheist believes in this regard, that nothing made everything. Right. And so our views are supposed to be outlandish and implausible. And yet, at the end of the day, they've got to convince themselves that nothing made everything, which is, you know, quite a leap of faith when you think about it, isn't it?
Indeed it is. Or if you wanted to be a little bit more sort of charitable, you would either have to choose between the view that there is a contingent being, sorry, I beg your pardon, that there is a necessary being, which is not the universe, or the universe itself has to be that necessary being. And if you want to make that latter claim, I'm going to say, please tell me why I should believe that anything in the universe, or indeed the universe as a whole, has that characteristic. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you, Ger. We leave it there, and thank you very much for your time.
All right, David, my pleasure.
Watching.